33-year-old Ann Linda Riffin drove away from her family's Montclair, New Jersey home for the last time in the spring of 1982. 10 days later, she resurfaced more than 2,000 miles away in southern New Mexico, where she'd found work and a place to stay. It had been an unannounced move, but one which she seemed satisfied with. A highly intelligent, caring, and kind woman, Anne found herself swallowed up by the beauty of the landscape, the complexities of the people, and the artistic community. For 3 months, she lived in the small village of Ruidoso until the day she mysteriously vanished. More than 2 weeks would pass before Anne's car was found abandoned off a little-used rural road in an area even locals describe as the middle of nowhere. The doors were locked, there were no signs of a crime, and the vehicle had no mechanical failures. More than 40 years later, some wonder if Anne chose to walk away and start a new life. Others believe she might have been injured or perhaps stricken with amnesia, while the rest theorize that Anne was the victim of a crime. This is Trace Evidence, Episode 220, The Vanishing of Ann Riffin. Welcome to Trace Evidence. I'm your host, Stephen Pacheco. Today we examine the mysterious disappearance of 33-year-old Ann Riffin. Before getting into the case, just a few notes about the show. Trace Evidence is a weekly true crime podcast focused on unsolved murders and disappearances. Visit trace-evidence.com for all social media links, episode breakdowns, donation options, and contact information. You can submit case suggestions through the website or by emailing me directly at traceevidencepod@gmail.com. As a final note, this year, CrimeCon will be taking place in Orlando, Florida from September 22nd through the 24th. I'll be there representing Trace Evidence on Podcast Row, and I hope to see you too. Visit crimecon.com and use promo code TRACE to save 10% on your pass. That's crimecon.com, promo code TRACE. More than 40 years ago, Ann Riffin drove off into the unknown. Weeks later, her abandoned car was discovered in the middle of nowhere along a rural stretch of road. How did her car come to be in that location? And just what happened to Ann herself? This is episode 220, The Vanishing of Ann Riffin. Whether it's due to the stunning vistas, vast landscapes, and towering mountains, the natural wonders of New Mexico have earned that state a fitting nickname, the Land of Enchantment. For hundreds of years, people have found themselves packing up and heading west, settling into the borders of the once wild and raucous territory. However, not all plans go the way they were meant to, and more times than can be counted, both locals and travelers who have passed beyond the borders of New Mexico have found themselves mysteriously vanishing into that vast unknown. When the New Mexico State Police received a report of an abandoned car in the fall of 1982, they didn't think much of it. The vehicle, sitting just off the road, showed no signs of damage, no evidence of robbery, nothing to suggest anything was wrong. Assuming the car had been purposefully abandoned, perhaps by a car thief, detectives were shocked when they notified the owner. As it turned out, the car itself was never missing. Strangely, it belonged to the youngest daughter of a well-to-do New Jersey family. 3 months earlier, she had headed west in secret in search of the splendor and beauty of New Mexico and a new place to call home. Now, she was at the core of a baffling mystery leading investigators over thousands of miles in search of a single trace of her. More than 4 decades later, and both Anne's disappearance and the days leading up to it have remained obscured, her fate unknown, and the answers lost somewhere in that glorious stretch of desert she found so enthralling. Ann Linda Riffin was born on Sunday, May 8th, 1949 in New Jersey to parents Irving and Babette. Ann was the Riffin's second child, coming 3 years after the birth of her older sister, Jane. Ann would be raised in the family home in Montclair, New Jersey, a wealthy suburban commuter town located in Essex County. Her father, Irving, was a known and respected physician, while her mother, Babs as she was commonly known, graduated from high school at the age of 15, and was highly involved in the local community, working as a volunteer for the Board of Education and Public Library. The Riffins, who were Jewish, raised their daughters to be devout in their faith, with Babs also volunteering on the board of their local temple. Friends and family described Anne as quiet, thoughtful, and an intelligent child who had a tendency towards shyness. While her older sister was more devoted to her schoolwork and more heavily involved in extracurricular activities, Anne is said to have been more introspective, creative, and expressionist. According to her parents, she spent much of her childhood drawing, painting, writing, and collecting wildflowers. She loved the beauty of the world around her, developed a fascination with nature, and often would try to capture that beauty and majesty on the page, whether it be through ink or brush strokes. In later interviews, Anne's parents discussed her development over the years, although usually this was done through direct comparison to her older sister. An article published in the Albuquerque Journal and featuring interviews with Irving and Babs focused in on the difference between the two, noting in part, quote, "Jane was everything Anne was not: competitive, assertive, sophisticated," end quote. Babs pointed out that when Jane turned 12 years old, there was a steady stream of boys dropping by the house to see her, while Anne never had any boyfriends. As a teenager, Anne attended Montclair High School, where she performed well academically and became highly involved in extracurricular activities herself. Her official listing in her senior yearbook notes multiple titles and clubs to which she had been attached, including Student Faculty Attendance Secretary, Information Officer, Mountie Movement, Junior Council, Mountaineer Editor-in-Chief, National Honor Society, Mountie Handbook Associate Editor, Whirlwind Associate Editor, Student Exchange Committee, and Photography Club, among others. Graduating in 1967, Anne would follow again in her sister's footsteps, attending the prestigious private women's school Wellesley College, located in the state of Massachusetts. Again, however, the comparison with her sister is pointed out, as while Jane made Phi Beta Kappa, the oldest academic honor society in America, Anne did not. She didn't perform poorly at college, quite the opposite, but those close to her felt Anne was struggling with her own sense of identity and the need to choose an area of focus and a career to follow it up with. While Anne tried to figure out what she wanted to do with her life, her sister graduated, married, began a career, and had children. There appeared to be somewhat of a competitive situation between the siblings, though whether or not this was a result of their own drives and desires or that of the environment in which they were raised is uncertain. Some have debated whether or not Anne might have felt resentful or unaccomplished due to the comparison, though no certain answer can be given. Asked whether or not he believed Anne may have been jealous of her older sister, Irving replied, quote, "I don't think it was overt," end quote. Regardless, Anne made the choice to exit that competitive arena, withdrawing from Wellesley in what would have been her junior year. Her reasons for leaving appear to have had more to do with what was going on in the world at the time, rather than anything to do with her sister, family, competition, or academics. The Vietnam War was raging, and college campuses had become hotbeds of protests and activism. Anne, a gentle soul according to those who loved her, struggled to accept both sides of the coin. Neither the war abroad nor the one at home made any sense to her. As her mother, Babette, explained, quote, "Everybody was protesting in those days, bombing and burning. Anne was too gentle. She didn't understand it. She came into this world at the wrong time." End quote. After leaving Wellesley, Anne retired to Marblehead, a coastal town along Massachusetts' North Shore. There, she put her focus and attention into what she felt would be the best use of her abilities. She began scribing a book, one which would discuss the importance of peace and Anne's own desire to see the world come together. Whether done out of curiosity or just to see what might happen, she eventually mailed the manuscript to Apple Records, the label founded by the Beatles, in 1968. Much to her surprise, she got a response from the label, who were very interested in her book. In fact, they invited Anne to England, where they wanted her to finish up the manuscript for publication. While Anne did make that trip and spent some time in England, the book itself was never published. Despite being described as shy and somewhat internalized, it appears that Anne had a love for travel and an interest in seeing much of the world. By this point in her life, she had visited Europe and Japan with her family, and while attending college, had been to Peru. Despite this, Anne's father would note that this didn't necessarily change his daughter's approach to life or perspective on it, telling the journal, quote, "Anne had been around the world, but she was never worldly," end quote. Following her time in England, Anne returned to the family home in Montclair, where she stayed for a time trying to figure out her next move. Curiously, this would lead her to Pennsylvania, where she led a youth hostel bicycling group on a long ride into neighboring Virginia. Upon arriving in historic Williamsburg, Anne was immediately taken by the history and beauty of the restored village, wanting to see more. However, she found herself frustrated as many of the younger folks on the trip didn't share her zeal for the location, wanting instead to move on. Babs explained, quote, "This upset her. She suddenly decided she wanted to become a history teacher. She called us and said, 'I want to turn young people on to history,'" end quote. Sticking in Williamsburg, Anne would enroll at the College of William and Mary, the second oldest institution of higher learning in the United States. Majoring in anthropology, she graduated in 1974 at the age of 25 and quickly was hired on as a teacher in a Williamsburg area middle school. However, her tenure there would only last 1 year as she was not invited back for a second term. According to her family, while Anne enjoyed the subject matter, she struggled when it came to managing her students. Next, she would find herself teaching at a private school, one which was run by an evangelical sect known as the New Testament Church. According to the family, the more time Anne spent around her new colleagues and friends, the more she developed an interest in Christianity. This was, of course, displeasing to her parents, who had raised her in Judaism. However, they noted that their daughter seemed to be happier and more positive when she was around and interacting with her new Christian friends. They did not express their disapproval outwardly, at least according to them, until Anne started trying to proselytize to them. According to Irving, she would often quote Bible passages at them and make comments about the Bible while attending temple services. Anne eventually left the new teaching position and bounced between different jobs in Williamsburg. At one point, she was hired on by a local real estate firm as a bookkeeper, and later she accepted the role of a private nurse for a couple from the church whose child had been born with a fatal illness. When the child sadly succumbed to this illness, Anne was devastated, and this seemingly ended her love affair with the area as she would return home to the family in Montclair. This return was somewhat bumpier for Anne than previous times had been. In hopes of continuing out on her own, she enrolled at a secretarial school and later would both work and live in New York City. But when this didn't last, she again returned home, and by the sounds of it, her parents were growing a little frustrated with what they termed a rudderless existence. According to Irving, they were beginning to feel like Anne was too old to be living at home, and for her part, Babs felt that Montclair wasn't a great place for her daughter to be at that time. She explained to the Journal, saying, quote, "Montclair is great if you're married. It's very bad if you're single. Anne had no friends here," end quote. Seemingly wanting to head out on her own and to begin something new, Anne left Montclair and traveled to Israel. Describing herself at the time as a Jewish Christian, she was hired on as the editor of a scientific journal, learned the Hebrew language, and would go on to write articles from Israel for the Jewish News, a New Jersey-based publication. A year later, she returned home and began looking for employment as a journalist, but that never panned out for her. As the situation between Anne and her parents continued to devolve, she was invited to move in with her sister for her dime, hoping that a change of scenery might inspire her and alleviate the tension that was building up. According to Jane, she and her sister got along well for the most part. Reportedly, Anne became close with her nieces and spent a lot of time with them, but there would come some clashes between Anne and Jane. According to her, Jane was frustrated with Anne's seeming lack of drive, noting that she was more than content to sit at home drawing and painting, rather than going out to find work or joining social groups. Jane told the journal, quote, "Anne was not an easy person to live with," end quote. By the early 1980s, Anne was in her 30s and was still floating in this seemingly self-induced limbo. No job, no solid group of friends, no plans. According to her parents, depression began creeping into their daughter's life around this time, and it quickly evolved from a small touch to an overwhelming complication. The deeper she sank into depression, the less she wanted to be involved in anything. According to Babs, it got to a point where Anne wouldn't even get up in the morning. She explained, quote, "Anne wouldn't get out of bed. I told her there were 9 million unemployed people in this country. I didn't think she would be one of them with her credentials," end quote. In hopes of helping Anne, her parents urged her to seek out psychological counseling, which she ultimately did. One part of the counselor's plan involved telling Irving and Babette to start charging Anne room and board, hoping that this might make her feel like she was contributing something more, but also to spur her on to find employment. In response, Anne apparently pleaded with her parents to wait until she had an established job before charging her. According to them, they agreed, but also urged her to get moving and find a job. And this, it has been said, only increased her sadness and the depression into which she was falling. Finally, less than a year after returning home, in the spring of 1982, Anne decided it was time to move on. Packing just a few items, she climbed into her car, a white 1979 Chevy Chevette registered in her father's name, and drove off. No one could have known it, but this would be the last time anyone in the family ever saw Anne again. Less than 6 months later, she would vanish, leaving behind a complicated list of questions with no apparent answers. When Anne drove away that spring afternoon, her parents believed they knew where she was going. Reportedly, Anne had made it appear as though the trip would be short, carrying her to Pennsylvania where she had planned to visit friends. However, that completely changed when a week later, the Riffins received a postcard out of Oklahoma. A few days later, they got a call from the 33-year-old who explained that she was in New Mexico, had been offered a job, and was planning to stay. According to Babs, they tried to be supportive. As she explained, quote, "We were glad Anne was doing something. Anne had been trying to find herself for a long time. We figured if she could last through this, she might be capable of making a new start," end quote. According to the family, they weren't exactly surprised to learn that Anne had ventured to New Mexico. Babs had visited the state as a teenager and told her daughter about how beautiful it was there. It seemed like a place that might be a decent fit for Anne, who was reported to have loved the mountains and could fit in well with the community and spoke Spanish fluently. In early June, Anne arrived in Ruidoso, a small village in Lincoln County adjacent to the Lincoln National Forest and at the time, home to just shy of 5,000 residents. Lincoln County carries a certain level of notoriety or perhaps infamy depending upon the source, as back in the 1870s and early 1880s, it was home to Billy the Kid and the much mythologized dispute between his employer, English businessman John Tunstall, and a group then known as the House, which consisted of Irish-American businessmen Lawrence Murphy, James Dolan, and John Riley. This cold dispute would turn hot and ultimately would be referred to as the Lincoln County War. Some have argued there were shades of commonality between Billy and Anne, two strong spirits who refuse to be nailed down in any one particular place and whose final days are marred by mystery and intrigue. For Anne, it is unlikely her arrival in New Mexico came along with any ill intentions, rather much the opposite, as she would quickly find herself falling in love with the people, the landscape, and the community. Seeking out employment, Anne arrived at Whispering Pines, a local restaurant that specialized in home-cooked meals and predominantly catered to tourists and those passing through the area. Ruth Ellis, then owner and operator of the restaurant, stated that Anne had stopped in to apply for work. She explained that most of her employment experience was in the form of childcare, but she had a hell of a pedigree. Ruth Ellis would note her confusion, telling the journal, quote, "I wondered why she would want to do this. But then, this is Ruidoso. and all sorts of people come through. End quote. On Monday, June 7th, 1982, Ann started her first shift at the restaurant, where she was paid $3.75 an hour. She cleaned pots, set tables, peeled potatoes, washed dishes, and cleaned the sink, among other duties. She seemed to enjoy her work, according to Ruth, who noted that Ann was exceedingly curious about every aspect of the business. At the same time, while she never seemed to run out of questions to ask, she had very little to offer about her own life. Ruth explained, quote, "She asked about everything in the kitchen. Most people who work at restaurants don't ask. On the other hand, she never told anybody anything about herself." End quote. Ann worked alongside Joan Stokes, Ruth's sister, who was a waitress in the restaurant. The timing of her arrival seemed to be fortuitous, as while Ann was looking for a place to stay, Joan was looking for a roommate. An agreement was quickly made between the co-workers, and soon Ann moved into Joan's cabin, located just 8 blocks from Whispering Pines. According to Stokes, the two got along very well, but that may have been due in part to their schedules. They began working opposite shifts and rarely saw one another, leaving little room for conflict. According to Joan, Ann was a homebody who preferred painting, writing letters, and reading to going out, socializing, and partying. She was quiet, reserved, and didn't make much of a splash. Ruth expanded on this, stating that Ann was sort of the opposite of what you normally expect of someone working in the restaurant business. She explained, quote, "Most people who work in restaurants are outgoing and flashy. Ann never tried to dress up or wear makeup. She was very conservative. She never dated either, and we had a lot of single men working here that summer." End quote. While she described Ann as sincere and kind, she also felt that there was a certain naivete to her, almost as though she didn't quite function on the same wavelength as most people. Her example was in the form of jokes, as she explained that Ann seemed to struggle with humor, frequently telling people that she didn't understand whatever the joke was that she had been told. Ruth, seemingly agreeing with Irving about his daughter not being worldly, stated that while Ann had been all over the world, you'd never have known it by talking with her. She went on to say, quote, "Ann could get lost driving from her cabin to the restaurant." End quote. No one is completely certain of what Ann got up to while she was in Ruidoso. She was exceedingly private, shared almost no information about her past, let alone her current activities, and for the most part had surrounded herself with people who didn't invest much in asking questions. As Joan Stokes would later put it, quote, "She was a very private person, and I am not a very nosy person." End quote. According to Joan, she never saw Ann spend much money, stating that she could only remember her purchasing a pair of shoes once during her time in the cabin. This made sense, as Babs would later comment that Ann wasn't very into money or material possessions and almost never spent cash unless she had to. However, it seems there were some expenses that no one can provide a solid answer for. It would later be determined by analyzing credit card records that during her time in Ruidoso, Ann had made at least 2 trips into Albuquerque, 180 miles to the northwest. What she had done there was again a mystery, as her roommate would tell investigators that Ann never mentioned the trips, gave details about where she went, nor who she may have been spending time with, if anyone. Outside of working, painting, and spending time at the apartment, Ann's life was as much a mystery to her new friends as it was to her family. Despite the fact that she called home and chatted with her parents every Sunday, she didn't tell them a great deal about what she was doing. According to Babs, while Ann enjoyed New Mexico, she started to get the feeling that her daughter might be looking to pick up stakes again. At one point, Ann apparently explained to her mother that she wanted to come home, but her parents encouraged her to stay, to stick it out and see what she could make of it. It would be a decision they would later come to regret. In the early days of September, Ann spoke with her mother and told her that she was planning to take a trip. She wanted to visit Colorado Springs, 500 miles north of Ruidoso. There, she planned to see relatives, cousins, and an aunt, and to celebrate the holiday of Yom Kippur, which was set to begin on Sunday, September 26th. She informed her roommate as well as her boss that she was going out of town for a trip, at which time she requested and was granted 2 weeks off. On Sunday, September 12th, Ann packed some belongings into her car and drove away from the cabin she'd been sharing with Joan Stokes for the past 3 months. She would never return, nor would she arrive in Colorado Springs, and for the next 2 weeks, no one saw, heard from, or had any knowledge of where Ann might be. No missing persons report was filed as, according to her mother, she was on vacation, so they didn't necessarily expect to hear from her. On the morning of Monday, September 27th, New Mexico State Police Officer Herman Silva headed out to respond to the report of an abandoned vehicle in the Mora Valley area, 100 miles northeast of Albuquerque as the crow flies, and nearly 200 miles north of Ruidoso. According to the report, delivered to Silva from a local rancher 1 week earlier, the car had been sitting in that same spot for days without any sign of the owner nor any understanding of why it was in that spot. Officer Silva would later state that he located the vehicle parked just off New Mexico Route 3, known today as New Mexico 518, near the small farming community of Holman, in an area known as Holman Hill, between Mora to the south and Tres Ritos to the north. While beautiful vistas abound in the area, locals would report that this could be an unforgiving stretch of land which was rarely utilized by travelers or tourists. The route from Ruidoso to Colorado Springs provides several different travel options, and while the route along New Mexico 3 can get you there, it is the one locals reported as being the least likely option to take. As a result, many have wondered one of two possibilities. Either that Ann got lost after mistakenly exiting from Interstate 25, or perhaps had some knowledge of the location and wanted to pass through, possibly with the intention of painting the landscape, only to get lost somewhere in the wilderness. At the end of the day, however, no one can say for certain why Ann took this particular path, nor can anyone prove that she was in fact the person who left her car in that spot. The vehicle was described as being a white 1979 Chevy Chevette with New Jersey license plates. Upon his arrival, Silva noted that there appeared to be personal belongings inside the car, no signs of damage to the vehicle, and the doors were locked. Given the out-of-the-way location in which the car had been found and the out-of-state plates, Silva stated that his first thought was car theft. He assumed that someone had stolen the vehicle and then later abandoned it in a location where they figured it might take a while to find. Operating under this assumption, Silva ran the license plate and found it was registered to Irving Riffin of Montclair, New Jersey. Officer Silva then placed a call to the Riffin residents to inform them that their missing car had been found, but he was caught off guard when the family stated that none of their vehicles had been stolen. When Silva read back the plates and gave a description of the vehicle, the person on the other end of the line suddenly came to life, saying, "Ann, that's Ann's car. What's happened to Ann?" It was this question that changed everything, as now an apparent auto theft was actually the first and perhaps the most mysterious clue in what would become a frustrating and difficult missing persons investigation. Gaining access to the vehicle, investigators didn't find anything that truly stood out to them. Firstly, it was noted that the car was in good shape, in full working order, and there was still a quarter tank of gas. There were no signs of a struggle, no signs of robbery, and nothing to suggest that any violence had occurred in or around the car. Inside, there were clothes and personal belongings, most of which were stored in luggage located on the passenger seat. They found a $50 bill and uncashed checks totaling $222.13. There were also several paintings Ann had apparently done while in New Mexico, along with blank canvases and painting supplies. Perhaps what caught her parents' attention was a stack of letters Ann had received from friends she'd made in the New Testament church. Several of the letters included invitations for Ann to come back to join the church and live in the local area. Utilizing Ann's personal address book, her mother wrote and called the authors of these letters in hopes that her daughter might have changed plans and gone to see them, but reportedly, none of them knew where she was, nor had they heard from her in weeks. The Riffins also considered the possibility that Anne may have been on that road intentionally, perhaps planning to visit a childhood friend, Linda Dutra, who was at that time living in Taos, 300 miles north from Ruidoso and along the way to Colorado Springs. That summer, while Anne was living in Ruidoso, her mother had written a letter to Linda and encouraged the two friends to reconnect, wanting her daughter to have someone she knew better as a friend in that area. For her part, Linda didn't believe Anne would be coming to see her since they hadn't seen one another or corresponded for several years. According to her, she got the letter from Babs, and the next time she heard Anne's name was when she went missing. Even if Anne had been planning to visit her, Linda noted that she would have strongly advised her against taking the New Mexico 3 route. She explained to the Journal, saying, quote, "If Anne were going to Taos, and I can't really believe she was coming to see me, I suppose she could have done some sightseeing on that road. But I never would have recommended she come through the Mora Valley. That's no place for a young woman to travel alone. The Mora Valley has a history of being strange and even dangerous." End quote. While there's nothing to suggest any connection, it's worth noting that in episode 216, I profiled the story of Barbara Holick, who went missing from Taos in 1995. With the Linda possibility mostly eliminated, considering if Anne was planning a visit, she certainly didn't inform Dutra, the Riffins turned their attention back to the church letters and advised investigators to start looking into religious groups and cults in the area. For detectives, there wasn't a lot of possibilities, and even those groups that they did track down appeared to have no connection to nor knowledge of Anne. This would become the first in a long series of dead ends, which would have investigators returning back to square one time and time again. While Anne's parents say she may have seen this as a viable possibility, joining up with a religious cult, her sister Jane did not, stating, quote, "Anne wasn't right for a cult. She was intelligent, but indecisive and troubled by life's ambiguities." End quote. Evidence was, unfortunately, in short supply for investigators. Since the vehicle had been sitting out for weeks prior to its discovery, rainstorms had wiped away any physical evidence or fingerprints that might have been on the exterior. While investigators have stated that they went through the vehicle interior, there's never been any statements made to suggest that any unexplained fingerprints, fibers, or hairs were found inside. As far as could be determined, there were only 2 items known to be missing: Anne's purse and her car keys. In hopes of turning up something, several searches were conducted in the area surrounding where the vehicle had been found, but none of them resulted in any new clues or pieces of evidence. In addition, investigators brought in bloodhounds to try and track Anne's scent. The dogs picked up on a scent, walked a little way down the hillside, and then stopped by the road. This might indicate that Anne got into a vehicle, or perhaps the rainy weather had damaged the hound's ability to track her and also may have washed away any footprints that she had left behind. While the Riffins wanted to go to New Mexico to work with police in trying to locate their daughter, they weren't able to at the time. Irving had suffered a heart attack the previous year, and then a second one not long before Anne went missing. Babs felt she needed to be there to help and take care of her husband, and so she requested that her brother, a lawyer, go in her stead. Lester Lieb arrived in New Mexico just a few days after Anne's car had been located. Lester traveled to Santa Fe, where he met with Sergeant A.P. Wickard of the state police, at which point he was told that, to that time, they had yet to uncover anything that might help unravel the mystery. Officer Silva spent several days interviewing and speaking with people in Holman, Tres Ritos, and Mora. He managed to locate an employee who worked at the Tres Ritos Lounge, approximately 7 miles from where the car had been found. She remembered seeing a woman who vaguely fit Anne's description asking for change in order to make a phone call around the time of the disappearance, but she could not say with certainty that the woman had in fact been Anne. The entire situation was baffling to investigators who couldn't make sense of the disappearance. Officer Silva would later express his confusion about why the car had been left in that particular location, saying, quote, "If the car broke down, you would pull it over to the side of the road. Where she left it, unless you were from around here, you wouldn't even know that place was there." End quote. Lester, in hopes of finding something that perhaps investigators had missed, focused his attention on the Mora Valley. He scouted through the area, looking for any trace of Ann or anyone who might have knowledge of her, but much like the police, found himself hitting a wall. There just didn't seem to be any answers, or if there were, no one had managed to find them. Lester eventually had flyers made up showing photos of Ann and asking for anyone with information to call police. The flyers advertised a reward for information of $500. Curiously, it may be the lack of information which made Ann's case stand out in the minds of investigators who worked it. As A.P. Wickard explained, not a single tip was called in on her case. Even news programs and Crime Stoppers, which had previously featured her story, did not receive any information. As quickly and mysteriously as Ann's disappearance had developed, her case began growing cold. Those living in the area who knew Ann were surprised by the circumstances, but also acknowledged that they never truly knew her that well. She wasn't much into talking about herself. So, in terms of possibilities, there were a great many which could neither be ruled in or out. While her family believed she had either joined up with another group, perhaps a religious one, investigators were trying to figure out if foul play had been involved. For his part, Officer Silva noted that he just didn't have any idea of what could have happened. A.P. Wickard of the state PD was unsure as well, though a little more specific, telling the Journal, quote, "I don't think foul play was involved, and where there's no body, there's no hope." End quote. Time began passing. The flyers bearing Ann's image and details grew old and faded. Many were removed and replaced with other missing persons flyers or local advertisement. Investigators, flustered with a lack of evidence, caught new cases to run down, and all the while Ann was out there, somewhere in the unknown, but the world kept on spinning. 2 years would pass, when in the summer of 1984, a new search for Ann would be conducted, this one headed up by someone from her past. R.D. Stewart had known Ann from her time in Williamsburg when in the early 1970s she had stayed for a time with Stewart and his wife. By the early 1980s, Stewart was living in Colorado Springs, and one afternoon, for no particular reason, he decided to give Ann a call back in Montclair. It was then he learned of her disappearance, and both he and his wife were so upset by it that they decided to see if there was anything they could contribute. The couple went on to spend a few days in northern New Mexico, visiting small villages, posting new flyers, and speaking to everyone they could about the missing woman. According to Stewart, the closest he ever got to breaking something was when a man he found in Holman claimed to have seen a woman resembling Ann painting in the woods, but that sighting was never verified and the woman was never located. Stewart struggled to come up with any answers or explanations for the disappearance. Ultimately, he found himself considering every possibility, telling the Journal in 1985, quote, "I have a funny feeling that Ann may have amnesia and not know who she is. The whole thing is baffling." End quote. That same year, A.P. Wickard discussed the case with the Journal as well. At the time, he was still working the case when he could and maintained contact with the family, often running down ideas that they developed back in New Jersey. He kept track of unidentified bodies and ensured that Ann's dental records were checked. There had been some alleged sightings, but none of them ever panned out. A woman resembling Ann was seen getting into a truck near Costilla, just south of the Colorado border, but that woman had a dog and Ann had no pets. Another woman resembling Ann was seen boarding a bus in Arkansas, but when she was tracked down, it was a case of mistaken identity. Wickard noted, quote, "I check out everything Miss Riffin tells me." End quote. One of the most wild pursuits came from an edition of People magazine. In the January 1985 edition, there had been a story about England's Princess Anne visiting a clinic in Bangladesh. Included in the article was a photo of a nurse holding a newborn baby. The Riffins, upon seeing that photo, immediately thought that the nurse bore a striking resemblance to Anne, and she had, in the past, worked as a nurse with children. Unfortunately, the Riffins managed to get confirmation from the Save the Children Foundation that the nurse was in fact a local woman and not Anne. Irving, frustrated and heartbroken, explained that any possibility had to be checked out, saying, quote, "We've been grasping at every straw," end quote. The more time passed, the more difficult it became for the family to maintain the hope of a happy outcome. Anne's family waffled back and forth between thinking the worst and hoping for the best. Had Anne run off to get away from them? That was perhaps a question too difficult to face head on. Babs explained, saying, quote, "I know I was a hovering mother. Perhaps I hovered too much. I know I gave Anne direction. Perhaps I gave her too much direction. She was no slouch, this girl. But Anne didn't think she'd done much. I told her, you've just got to find what you enjoy doing. I can't help but thinking that someone knocked Anne on the head and threw her down a cellar. We don't want to intrude on Anne. She's entitled to do what she pleases. We just want to know if Anne is safe and let her know that we love her." End quote. For his part, Irving wondered if perhaps his daughter's mental health may have played a role in her disappearance. She had been so depressed when she left New Jersey, and Irving couldn't help but think that maybe she made the decision to harm herself. The paintings found in Anne's car had been returned to the Riffins, who hung them in their home. Speaking to the Journal, Irving analyzed his daughter's paintings for psychological implications, saying, quote, "Anne's earlier works were different. The swirls in these paintings are more violent. These paintings remind me of Van Gogh's last works, before he went mad." End quote. Some, however, believed that the answers were in New Mexico, somewhere, whether they were being concealed or had simply been missed. Dorothy Vigil, who had worked as a postmaster general in Holman for more than a decade at that time, couldn't quite remember the details of the disappearance, noting that there hadn't been much information shared locally. She explained, quote, "If this thing had happened to somebody from around here, there would have been much more of a fuss made about it. But she was a stranger. Nobody heard of her or saw her." End quote. For those who knew and loved Anne, life would go on, though there would always be that vacant hole in their hearts. 8 years after her disappearance, on December 29th, 1990, Anne's father Irving passed away at the age of 77. Throughout his final years, he had continued to walk a fine line, both hoping to see his daughter again, but also facing the cold rationality that if no one had seen or heard from her for so many years, there was unlikely to be a joyful reunion. 16 years later, on February 26, 2006, Babette passed away at the age of 90. Officer Herman Silva noted that he'd been in contact with Babs a lot over the years. She remained invested and hoped for something, anything, but no word ever came, and she sadly went to her grave without knowing what had become of her youngest daughter. When last seen, Anne Linda Riffin was described as being a white female with brown hair and eyes, standing 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing approximately 125 pounds. At the time, Anne's hair was cut short, slightly above shoulder length, and she wore brown horn-rimmed glasses. Anne has scars on her back and her left knee. She was last seen leaving her apartment in Ruidoso, New Mexico on Sunday, September 12, 1982. Her car, a white 1979 Chevy Chevette, was found abandoned but in working order just off New Mexico 3 near Holman, south of Tres Ritos and north of Mora. No trace of Anne has ever been found. Her dental records and DNA are available according to her NamUs listing, and there have been multiple rule-outs over the years. Anne was 33 years old when she vanished, and if alive today, would be turning 74 next month. Anne Riffin was always looking for the place where she fit, the job she could love, the friends she could spend her time with. She painted, danced, wrote poetry, and had a love for art, architecture, and the boundless wonders of nature. One spring afternoon, she found herself drawn out into the wilds of New Mexico, perhaps enchanted by the majesty of those landscapes, the heavenly hues of the mountains, and the quiet reserve of the desert. Whether or not Anne found what she was looking for can never be known, and while many hope that she is still out there somewhere, living a life she can feel happy and content with, others are more convinced that the answers lie somewhere in the unforgiven sprawl of desolation surrounding Holman Hill. The disappearance of Ann Riffin is utterly baffling. An intelligent, well-traveled woman moves to New Mexico and sets herself up well. She picks up a job, finds a place to live, and for 3 months she spends her time in Ruidoso, making friends, taking painting classes, and exploring the natural environment. That's about as much as we know about it, though. Notoriously private, almost never speaking about her own life, even though she worked and lived with, can't say for certain what she'd spent her free time doing, nor who she may have spent it with. What exactly drew her to New Mexico? That's a vastly more difficult question to answer. Her mother, Babs, speculated that it may have been due to the fact that she had visited the state when she was a teenager and had relayed to her daughter how beautiful and wonderful it was. While we can't know for certain, that seems to make sense. Despite how Anne is described, as this person who sort of floated between jobs, never locked into anything, and wasn't truly sure what she wanted to do, she accomplished a hell of a lot. College degree, world traveling, jobs in different areas requiring intelligence and drive. She works as a teacher, a nurse, a journalist, none of which is exactly easy. Part of my belief that what took her to New Mexico was her mother's descriptions of the state bounces back to her time in Israel. Knowing her parents are frustrated with her turn towards Christianity, she moves to Israel, where she learned to speak Hebrew, became the editor of a scientific journal, and wrote articles for the Jewish News, which released where? In New Jersey, where her parents lived. No one could say it with any certainty, but it sure appears that Anne was trying to show her parents what she was capable of by focusing in on areas that they had a specific interest in. Regardless of why, Anne leaves New Jersey, doesn't say where she's going, and a week later calls home to say she's settled in Ruidoso. Her parents are happy for her, feeling like she's off doing her own thing, and they're supportive of the decision. It's their belief that maybe, for the first time, Anne will find somewhere that she feels she belongs, a group of friends she can rely on, and from there, who knows what she might do. She writes poetry, paints the landscape, and calls home every Sunday to check in. Finally, in early September, she talks about a trip to Colorado Springs, but she never arrives. No one reports her missing because at the time, no one knows she is missing. It takes 2 weeks before anybody becomes the wiser. Anne's car was found abandoned along a stretch of New Mexico 3, today New Mexico 518, where it curves and weaves its way north from Mora, through Holman, and up towards Tres Ritos. It's an area that is not highly traveled nor highly populated and is comprised mostly of farmers. At the time of Anne's disappearance, it was hay cutting season. Now, while there is desert there, and quite a bit of it, there's also the Lincoln National Forest, which New Mexico 3 butts right up against. The exact area in which Anne's car was found is sort of wedged between the desert to the south and the forest to the north. Curiously, we've never gotten much detail about that specific location. While Anne's family says her car was stuck in a ditch, Officer Silva said this was a pull-off area that, unless you were highly familiar with it, you wouldn't have known it was there. Suffice it to say, it seemed a planned stop, done intentionally. As Silva noted, had she experienced car trouble, he'd have expected to have found her car just off the side of the road, or possibly still partially on it. Now, according to investigators, rain in the days after Anne's disappearance destroyed any potential physical evidence, as well as likely washing away any footprints she may have left. According to weather data from the time of her disappearance, it hadn't rained for days before she left on her trip, and it wouldn't start raining until the afternoon of September 18th, 5 days after she was last seen. This suggests that there's less of a chance that she'd gotten caught up in the mud, as the dirt would have been bone dry. Whether or not she could have gotten stuck in a ditch remains possible, but I believe if that was the case, then investigators would be a little less confused about why the car was left where it was. Of course, there remains the debate about whether or not Anne was actually the one who left it there at all. Some have speculated over the years that perhaps Anne picked someone up who had ill intentions, or maybe was accosted somewhere along the way, at which time someone else took control of the vehicle. Given the wide open nature of this case, there really is no ability to solidly rule out any particular theory. Certainly Anne could have left the car there for one reason or another, but additionally, she may not have been anywhere near that car when it was finally dumped. Investigators noted the absence of robbery, no signs of an attack, and no evidence of a crime. This, of course, makes everything vastly more complicated. That's essentially what everyone was left with. There were no confirmed sightings, no pieces of evidence, nothing that might provide an answer as to how the car came to be there, nor why Anne may have taken this route over the more likely selections, such as Interstate 25. How do you try to narrow down the possibilities when essentially everything is possible? It's not an easy task to accomplish, especially when you can't find anything to even point you in the right direction, let alone any direction. Despite putting up flyers, getting coverage in and on local news, and partnering up with Crime Stoppers, not a single useful tip was ever called in on this case. For some, that makes sense. Anne was a private person who didn't spend a lot of her time interacting with others. Simultaneously, though, many find it suspicious that no one saw Anne that day or at any time after her disappearance. Sure, everyone noticed the car, but no one actually saw it arrive, nor who was driving it. One of the theories developed early on was that Anne may have joined up with a religious group, went to a commune, or perhaps found herself involved in some type of a cult. Given her past experience working with the New Testament church, her parents wanted to ensure that these possibilities were thoroughly investigated. According to Officer Silva, he managed to track down members of the church, but none of them had heard from Anne since she'd vanished. In terms of local groups, he visited several religious sects, but found no connection to Anne. He even visited some of the communes in the area, but again, found no one who had knowledge of Anne. Given her natural desire to keep moving, it seems unlikely she would have locked herself into any particular group, which may have limited those abilities. She was certainly searching for something, a sense of belonging, a community, but it doesn't appear that she found exactly what she wanted. According to Babette, in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, Anne had been discussing the possibility of coming back home. Her parents encouraged her to stay in New Mexico, hoping that she'd commit, get things moving, and finally establish some sense of stability, but it doesn't appear that that ever happened. Even if she loved the area, Anne, it seems, was looking to move on. That's a fact supported by both what was found in her car and the statements of her landlord. While Anne had told her boss she needed 2 weeks off, told her family she'd be visiting relatives in Colorado Springs, and told her roommate she'd be back in 2 weeks, a search of her room showed that she had taken all of her belongings with her. She left nothing behind, not a single stitch of clothing or scrap of paper. This led many to believe that maybe, like when she had left New Jersey and said she was going to Pennsylvania, perhaps her trip to Colorado Springs had taken a turn, or she outright decided she was going somewhere else. Everyone who knew her in New Mexico believed she was planning to return, but the evidence seems quite to the contrary. Beyond running off on her own, there was some debate about her mental health around this time. We know in the months leading up to her trip to New Mexico, Anne had been struggling with depression. It had gotten so bad that she wasn't getting out of bed, and her parents advised her to seek counseling. The move seemed to have raised her spirits, at least for a time. She was happier, healthier, and having a good time in the region. That slowly changed, though, and as those darker thoughts crept back in, she kept finding herself looking for a new direction, a change in her life. Did that lead her to walk away from everything in the middle of nowhere? Perhaps, But extensive searching in that area turned up nothing to suggest where she could have gone, why she'd have left everything behind, and how she'd have gotten there in the first place without her car. The last theory, which has been considered, is probably the most obvious, but also the most difficult to prove. Many believe that Ann had to have been the victim of foul play, whether she was taken from her vehicle, at which time a suspect dumped it where it was found, or perhaps she had a traveling companion who may have had sinister intentions. There's no way of knowing for certain. All we can say is that nothing found at the scene suggests a crime occurred. At the same time, there's no way of knowing if where Ann's car was found was actually the scene of the crime. Ann could have become friends with someone in the area who did something terrible to her. She may have picked someone up who was hitchhiking for a ride. Hell, she may have stopped to help someone who was feigning car trouble in an attempt to abduct or assault whoever came along. The fact of the matter is, we have no way of knowing for certain what might have happened. And at the end of the day, that makes Ann's disappearance one of the most confusing, perplexing, and frustrating that I've ever covered. A bright, talented, sensitive, and caring woman headed west for a new beginning. She found work and a place to stay. She made friends, took art classes, and seemed to finally be in her element. Then one quiet September afternoon, she drove away from her cabin and never returned. More than 40 years later, and the mystery of her fate continues to endure. Her parents have since passed away, never learning the truth, while her sister remains but is now well into her 70s. Not one person who knew and loved Ann has heard a word from her since September of 1982, and the investigation grew cold within days and has never heated back up. Sadly, without new information, the finding of Ann, or an outright confession, the vanishing of Ann Riffin, will remain open, unsolved, and absolutely frozen. If you're looking for more information about the vanishing of Ann Riffin, there are many forum posts and newspaper articles that touch on it. For this episode, the Albuquerque Journal was the most helpful and thorough source. Also, if you're interested in learning more about unsolved cases in New Mexico, I highly recommend you check out the podcast True Consequences. Eric does an amazing job covering cases from all across the state, approaching each episode with incredible professionalism and empathy as the family member of a murder victim himself. If you have any information on the vanishing of Ann Riffin, please contact the Montclair Police Department at 973-744-1234. Her case number is 310-134-82. You can also email the New Mexico State Police Cold Case Unit at coldcase.homicideunit@state.nm.us. That's coldcase.homicideunit@state.nm.us. What do you believe happened? Tweet me at TraceEvPod, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com, or comment in the Facebook group. At this time, I'd like to take a moment to thank our amazing Patreon producers: Alicia Lorraine, Andrew Guarino, Ann Bertram, Camelia Tyler, Christine Greco, Danny Renee, Daerthy, Denise Dingsdale, Diane Dyson, Eloanne Meyer, Fabulous TT, Guillermo Pinto, Jennifer Winkler, Julie A. Mangano, Justin Snyder, Kara Moreland, K.Y., Lars Jensen Fangel, Leslie B., Madison Lahoulier, Marla Wright, Melissa Breckeisen, Nick Mohar Shores, Sarah Lyons, Travis Skepko, Stacy Finnegan, Stephanie Joyner, Stephanie Eve, Tiffany Nelson, and Tom Radford. Without your amazing support, this show would not be possible, So thank you all so much for contributing to Trace Evidence. One quick reminder, if you're planning on attending CrimeCon this year in Orlando, Florida, use promo code TRACE at crimecon.com to save 10% off your pass. Once again, that's promo code TRACE at crimecon.com. If you're interested in learning more about this case or other cases featured on the show, please visit trace-evidence.com. There you can find case breakdowns, all social media links, merchandise shops, case descriptions, media, and options for donating, including PayPal and Patreon, should you wish to support the show. This concludes our look into the mysterious 1982 vanishing of Ann Riffin from New Mexico. I want to thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll join me next week for another unsolved case on the next episode of Trace Evidence.